Right at the beginning, let me apologize that I have to speak in English. मला मराठी येतं, मराठी समजतं, बोलू शकतो, but it's very difficult to hold forth on any kind of long lecture in Marathi, and therefore I will choose English as my language. Let me also say thank you very much to Sahitya Rangabhoomi Pratishthan, Ashok Kulkarni, whom I have known for a very long time. I have also been associated with Vinod Doshi and Saryu Doshi for, I don't know, I've forgotten how many years it's been since we have known each other. So for me, in a way, it's a kind of family regathering. I mean, coming together. So when Ashok said to me, what would you like to speak on? My first thought was I should speak on something to do with entertainment. Ultimately, I'm an entertainer. I'm a writer and a playwright, and I'm an actor, and I'm a film actor and other things. So I should write about entertainment. And then I thought it's probably more befitting the dignity of the occasion if I talk about the arts rather than entertainment. And the connection between the entertainment and arts is not so impossible or so distant. Marshall McLuhan, Canadian sociologist, says the main difference between entertainment and art is that an art form is only an entertainment form which has lost its audience, which has become outdated. There was a time when, drama was entertainment. Now it has lost its audience, it's become art. There was a time when films were popular and we used to sneer at films. Now films have become art form because they are losing their audience. Similarly, television tomorrow might become art form also, you never know. So there is this connection. Ultimately, I decided on a much broader subject of modern Indian culture for reasons that I will explain to you. The question, of course, is not so much the question of culture as modern Indian. Where do you start modernity in India when you started looking at history? The temptation is to say, let's start in 1947 when we became independent. But the fact is, in fact, that Indian culture didn't undergo any sudden change. India underwent other kinds of changes, but it didn't go any sudden change in 1947. Many of the changes that we see in India today had started much earlier. We need to go back further into our history to see a point from which we can say modern India started in a particular way. So I'm going to choose the point in my discussion of the point when colonialism came to India and settled down, and the colonial regime took over India. This is when the British came and started ruling us. Now, the British introduced, to simplify our entire history, the British introduced two very important changes in our entire existence. First, of course, they introduced English as a language of discourse. Now I'm talking to you, I'm from Karnataka, you're here in Maharashtra, I should be talking to you probably in Marathi or in Hindi, but I'm talking to you in English. This is, of course, a gift of the British administration. Now, of course, the British didn't intend to create English writers in India, English poets in India, but they wanted only administrators, clerks, they wanted people who could do accounting. But the fact is that English had this tremendous backlog of cultural heritage, which was very exciting to 18th and 19th century Indians, so that they took from it, and English helped in many exciting ways. But what it did, the introduction of English, is that by introducing us into English discourse, it changed our own discourse about our own society. Because now we look at each other, we look at our society in terms of concepts which have come from the West, which were coined by the West. Now, this is where the word culture itself is very important. In the end of the 19th century, early 20th century, where does it come from? What is let me say, what is the Indian word for culture? Sanskriti. And you know who coined it? It was coined by Rabindranath Tagore. And there was a big debate in Bengal about what Indian word would perfectly translate the British concept of culture, and Tagore suggested Sanskriti. Suniti Kumar Chatterjee suggested Krishti, which was in fact a better word, because culture also suggests agriculture. You do cultures with skin, you could do culture with plants, and this. But Tagore said no, and Tagore went out in the debate, and we use Sanskriti, which has suddenly taken the word to a much greater sophistication and height than probably the word culture has. In fact, Raymond Williams says that the word culture is one of the most difficult words in the English language to define and to understand. But anyway, I won't go into that. The main thing I want to suggest is that because of English, and this will come across during my lecture right through, how we began to look at our own way of life. I don't know what the exact Indian translation would be. Probably sampradaya, probably achar, probably, there are so many other terms, but they also have their own connotations. But anyway, here we are stuck with English and stuck now for this evening with the concept of culture. The second development which is significant since after the coming of the British was the development of the colonial cities. Now, this is often forgotten, that the British brought their own kind of cities in India. Of course, there were cities in India before. There was Delhi, there was Pune, there was Kolhapur, all that happened. But what the British did is they created what might be called colonial cities. They started these factories where there were ports. They were traders, they were good at seafaring activity, so they started their cities in Calcutta, Madras, and Bombay, which were actually fishing communities. There they built their own factories, and as they succeeded in trading, as they succeeded in politics, as well as in training, as in economics, Indian traders came and collected around them, and cities grew, and so slowly these three spots and other spots around with them, like Mangalore, developed from fishing villages into major trading communities, major trading centers and cities. So these became the colonial cities. Now, you see, there was, as I said, there were before the Indian cities, but there was a major difference between Indian cities, what I'm called true traditional Indian cities, and the colonial cities. The difference was that in Indian cities, there was a continuity of values between the cities and the countryside. If someone lived in the city and he had a cousin in the countryside, they believed more or less in the same values, such as family, such as, caste, such as religion, who should marry whom, how one should treat one's uncle, and so on. There was a set of values which was continuous and made the city and the countryside almost continuous. And of course, there was the economic activity, which is that many of the artisans, many of the workers lived in the countryside. If you wanted to build a house, you sent to the village of the, house builders. You could send for carpenters. They all came from the villages. They worked in the cities, and they went back. And so there was an understanding of what a way of life or a cultural way of life was between people who lived in the city and the village. But this changed once the colonial cities came, because the colonial cities developed their own set of values which were imported from the West. And the major value that was to define these cities was of individualism, of free trade, and certain notions like caste was bad, joint family was wrong, nepotism was not acceptable, and that there should be individual merit, and one should be recognized for what. Many of these values, I don't have to go into them. We know that they have become common practice now and common acceptance. And these really were the ruling value systems of the city. So anyone who settled in these cities had to adhere to them, or at least pretend that he accepted these values and behaved according to them. There's a very beautiful example of this in a Urdu novel called Umrao Janada. Umrao Janada was written by a courtesan. It's called Courtesan of Lucknow. She lived in Lucknow in 1857, before and after 1857. And Umrao Janada, she was a courtesan and lived in a courtesan's quarter, narrates a very beautiful incident, and which suggests how the society changed. She says, there was a man called, this was before the revolution and before the British came, there was a man called Chote Sahab, Nawab Chote Sahab. He was a Nawab, and he fell in love with a courtesan. And he came to her, and he wanted her to accept him, but she wouldn't accept him. So the Nawab went and jumped into the river He tried to commit suicide. But you see, he had a cloak, so he floated down the river. He didn't sink. And as he floated down the river, the Nawab Wajid Ali Shah was coming in a boat, in a barge, and from far he saw this person, spectacle of a person, floating down the river, and he fished him out. And he asked the Nawab, what has happened? And Nawab Chote Saab said, this is what's happened. I'm heartbroken. I want to commit suicide, and I don't know what to do, etc. So Nawab was so pleased with the story and with the demeanor of Chote Saab that he made him an officer of the kingdom, give him a post in the kingdom. And then Umrao Jan adds, such beautiful things used to happen in the days of yore. Now that the British have come, nothing matters except merit. So you see, the whole advent of meritocracy, and how it affected the values and so on. And so, when we look, the aspects I'm looking at how these values changed, is this of art. And since these people who followed the 19th century British values, Indians who came into trade, came into business, settled down in these villages, and they became what would be, if I may use a Marxist term, the new bourgeoisie of the cities. They adopted the values, and naturally they imitated the rulers. And imitation is always easy in a public sphere. They didn't change their way of life, but they changed the way of life in the open. And it really first begins in the theater. You see, and this is where it affects me now here. The Indian society, particularly upper caste Indian society, had always considered entertainment a lower caste activity. People, entertainers in the streets, entertainers in the fields, they were always kept out. The upper caste people never did it. Upper caste women were not allowed to indulge in it. And till the British came, you get this whole horror of, any upper caste person. If you have read Smriti Chitri by Lakshmi Bai Tilak, she refers in great detail as to how Brahmin children were not allowed to watch plays because it was considered corrupting. But the British admired theatre. They indulged in theatre. They used to have theatre in their clubs. Their Mem Saabs used to act in it. The Indians were not allowed to watch them in the clubs and so on. So what happens is that the Indians themselves start looking at them, a new kind of form, a new kind of theatre, indulging in it. And in Bombay, for instance, you get the Parsi theatre. And the British theatre introduced two new concepts in Indian entertainment. One concept was the concept of proscenium, a stage like this, a proscenium arch. This comes from the West. Our plays never happened, never took place like that. Our plays in ancient India, there was no real difference between the audience. The audience used to sit there and come, and the stage was wide open. But with the British kind of theatre, what happens is that there is a difference between what happens on stage and what happens from the auditorium. The audience is kept out, kept in the dark, and the stage is isolated. This is one major difference. But an even more important difference came with the introduction of ticketing. The whole idea that you have to pay money to see entertainment came from the West. Indians didn't have that idea. Till the 19th century, plays happened. How did plays happen? If you wanted a child, you would go to a temple and say, if I have a child, I will do a play, a show in the name of the god. Or the local minister or local prince or someone would sponsor a show, and everyone was invited to come and watch it. People came. They were not expected to pay for watching it. And so the artists and the art was paid for entirely by the landowning classes or the richer classes for whatever specific purpose. But once you ask the audience to pay money, the entire attitude to entertainment changes. You see, until then, art was only an artistic, aesthetic risk. People came, and if the play didn't work out, well, they lost nothing. I mean, they lost one night, that's all. They then got up and left, and that was all. But when you pay money, this whole experience becomes a financial risk. Then you say, I paid 5 rupees, I paid 10 rupees, and have I got my 10 rupees worth of entertainment? So a whole new attitude to entertainment comes with the introduction of ticketing, which really actually, one of the, as you know, one of the pioneers of ticketing in India was Bhave in Maharashtra, Vishnupan Bhave. And then it was taken up by the Parsis and so on, Parsis in Bombay and then Maharashtra. What happened because of ticketing is supremely illustrated by the Parsi theatre. In Bombay, the Parsis were the businessmen. They had the money. They were very good at whatever the British used to do. So they also went into theatre. They built theatres in Grant Road Theatre and built and so on. But they knew that the audience was largely Hindu, and that the entertainment that they had to sell, to the audience was Hindu mythology, something that appealed to them. So although they initially began with Arabian Nights and so on, soon they were telling mythological tales. But the language that was very popular was earlier Gujarati, but really turned out to be Hindi. And the people who could write well in Hindi were Muslims. So suddenly you got a whole industry which was financed by Parsis for a Hindu audience and written by Muslims. In a sense, you could say the real origins of secularism in our country begins in theatre, when you get Aga Hashar Kashmiri writing about Harishchandra, and financed by whichever. But what happens with this is the audience becomes less and less keen to take risks. What they want, each show becomes a replication of the earlier show. If yesterday I came and I paid 10 rupees and I saw a show in which there were 7 songs, I come today and pay 10 rupees and there are only 5 songs, I then protest. I say, why have I been diddled? I mean, the money becomes a standard of performance. In the earlier days, before the ticketing performance, and this is a tradition that has remained now only in music, where in music an artist is allowed to fail. Because the one advantage when the audience doesn't pay is that it's tolerant of what happens. It is tolerant of mistakes. It lets the artist fail. For instance, this tradition continues here in India even today, where you forgive artists in music, but not in other forms, if they come and don't perform well. Those who have seen Bhimsen Joshi on his more drunken nights will have experienced this. And I know I was in Madras when T.R. Mahalingam, the great flautist, came one day and the audience was packed. He couldn't stand. He was carried on. He was carried out. The organizers apologized and said, tomorrow please come. Next day the audience comes. The same thing happens. Third day, Mahalingam comes and says, sorry, there's Sashtang Namaskar, and plays beautifully all through the night. And the audience only talks about that night. His entire drunkenness is forgotten. This is what great artists do. This is the great tradition of our music. And that tradition really comes when artists were allowed to take the risk of failing. And that risk of failing is possible if finances are not involved of the audience. But once the audience takes these financial risks, the the question of entertainment becomes commodified. It becomes, and theatre becomes business. This is what happens. Around the middle of the 19th century, theatre ceased to be an occupation and became a business of the people. Now, the British introduced another innovation, which was also to change our notion of entertainment completely, which is that they projected Shakespeare as the great summum bonum of British culture. Now, when the rulers are ruling and they're always admired for their culture and the ruled always want to imitate them. Now, if the British had said, our culture is represented by Homer or Milton, we had our Mahakavis, we had our Vyasa and Valmiki or whoever it is. If they had said, we are represented by Plato or Aristotle or whoever it is, we had our Shankara or whatever it is. But the British said Shakespeare represented them, and there was no playwright at that time. And the reason why there was no playwright is the interesting thing, which very few people notice, is that Sanskrit plays were written from 3rd century BC to 6th century AD, And then playwriting stopped. And then from 8th century till the 18th century, there are no plays in India. No one writes plays. It doesn't mean that there is no theatre. There is theatre. Theatrical activity flourishes. In fact, plays like Yakshagana, plays like Kathakali, they all came out into existence in the 15th century. But the whole notion that a playwright sits and writes a play, that another actor takes it and learns his lines, and they rehearses, and then they do it, was an entirely foreign notion to Indians, because in Indian, as the vernaculars came up, as Sanskrit receded as the language of culture, the belief was that actors should be able to improvise. They should be able to improvise their dialogues. They knew, and in Yakshagana, for instance, there are what's called Talamaddale, where the actors just sit. They don't even wear costumes. They just sit, and they improvise dialogue. And people come to listen to them because this ability to improvise the dialogue was what distinguished a theatrical performance. But after 19th century, what happens is, thanks to Shakespeare, thanks to the great admiration we have for the British, we need a playwright, and we ultimately find him, as you know, in Kalidasa. Now, Kalidasa was admired by Gaita, he was admired by Sir William Jones, and who called him the Indian Shakespeare. So immediately Kalidasa is turned into a great representative of Indian culture. The interesting thing about Kalidasa is Kalidasa was always recognized as a great poet, as a great playwright, but he was never seen as a great representative of Sanskrit culture or Hindu culture till the 19th century. No one felt the need to, for instance, translate him. But what happens is between 1860 and 1880, there are 4 translations of Kalidasa's plays in Marathi. In Kannada, there are 2. Suddenly, it says the Maharashtra and Karnataka between them woke up to Kalidasa, and they didn't know that he was there. Suddenly, they're translating him, and they feel they have to show that they have a playwright. And this really comes from the great admiration that they not only have for Kalidasa, but it's a kind of reflected admiration from the admiration they have for Shakespeare, for instance, and Shakespeare's plays. As I need hardly tell this audience, modern Marathi theatre, for instance, starts with Annasaheb Kirloskar's great, very successful production of Shakuntal, and he goes to Sanskrit. Sanskrit plays in it, but in the introduction to Subhadra, in the play that Saubhadra that he written, I was just talking to Makarand Sate here. He says, I want to create rasa in the English fashion. I don't know the exact phrase, and I was asking Makarand whether he remembered the exact phrase. What Annasaheb Kirloskar says, something like Ingraji Paddhatichi Rasa Nirmiti. You know, he wanted rasa, but wanted it like in the English fashion. So this shows how a new notion of entertainment, of rasa, was coming into it. Then there is the example of Khadelkar, who, as you know, his play was banned because Kichak was supposed to be a parody of, was an attack on Kichak, on Curzon and on the British and so on. And he worked for Kesari. He was a staunch, Indian patriot. And yet Khadelkar, when he writes, Savai Madhavrao and Samrutyu, Savai Madhavrao, the main character, is based on Hamlet, and the villain, his uncle, is based on Iago. So Iago and Hamlet become actually persons to emulate in theatre. And this shows Shakespeare's great influence on Indian psyche. He taught us psychology, really. It was not other psychologists who taught it. It's by looking at Shakespeare we learned him. Then there is I'm just taking Marathi examples. Gadkari, for instance, who wrote that, before I die, I want to write at least 18 plays, because I know Shakespeare wrote 36, and I know I'm only half as good as Shakespeare. Now, the interesting thing, apart from the influence of Shakespeare on these playwrights, is the fact that all these playwrights are from the upper categories of caste. There are the Brahmins or CKPs or whoever it is. So between the early part of the 19th century and latter part of the 19th century, you see what transformation theatre has undergone in Indian society. In Maharashtra, similar thing happened in Bengal, for instance, where the middle class picked up theatre. So theatre, which was considered, or entertainment, which was considered a lower caste profession, a lower caste category, slowly becomes enriched in the 18th century, uplifted, becomes socially very acceptable. And this happens, the main reason this happens is that theatre becomes a profession. Earlier it was a caste calling. If you belong to certain caste, you didn't do it. But now when it becomes a profession, it goes into economics. It's like opening a shop. And if you're a Brahmin or if you're any other caste, it is still open to you to go and get into that profession and make it your own. As a result of what happens, and I hope I'm not offending anyone when I say that from 1880s to now particularly, the Marathi and the Kannada, the theatres, the playwriting in the theatres are all dominated by upper castes. And those castes which had kept entertainment going through the centuries earlier, those who did tamasha, or whatever it is, Bharud or these hundreds of forms, they are treated as somehow not quite civilized, not quite cultured. They go out of the cultural life of the people. They are virtually pushed out, and culture becomes, and this is the point I want to make here, that throughout the 18th century, thanks to the British influence, and culture becomes a prerogative, culture which was kept alive through the centuries by the lower castes, by the people who lived on it as a living. It gets transformed into a category by which the upper castes call themselves artistic, call their own culture, how they define. For instance, as you know, after Kirloskar's Shakuntal and so on, it was the Brahmanis' whole way of life that was glamorized as the way of life that Krishna and other people must have lived. I mean, that way of life, the speech, the way the women dressed, everything got glamorized into a new category, and people are very proud of it. Now, this represents a kind of transformation in society which is reflected everywhere. What happens is this. Here it's an example of theatre. In Maharashtra it's particularly clear, but it was also clear in Bengal. What happens is, what was done by people in the village then moves to that done by people in towns and cities. The art moves from village to the city. It moves from lower caste to upper caste, and it moves from just being a vocation to business. It's okay to go into theatre because you make money, get paid, you can have estate, you can have a status in society because of the financial thing. Now, I would like to argue this evening, and that's my, I think, thesis, which is open to question, which is that right to the 19th century in India, this is what happens. That slowly, those castes which were at the lower end of the society and had kept many of these arts going were pushed out. And these traditions were taken over by the upper caste. So another example I'll give you is from painting. No, the British didn't interfere in theatre. They were not interested. But when they came, they realized that Indians needed to be taught painting. They didn't like Indian painting. They thought that Indians were very good at design, and but they had no science. They needed to be taught science. The one philosophy of 19th century was the positivist philosophy, which is that you needed science to be morally superior. It gave you moral strength. And they saw that Indians, these designs and the inability to do naturalism and the inability to do human form properly, all were kind of indicative of a certain kind of moral weakness in the Indians. So the British decided to correct this and to teach Indians how to paint. And again, schools of art were created in the beginning by private people, but later on they were taken over by the government in Madras, in Calcutta, in Bombay, and then also in Lahore, and so on. And the whole intention was to teach Indians how to be better painters. Now, there were two philosophies that were being worked out at that time in England about painting. One was the kind of painting as a great art form, which was the philosophy of the Royal Academy. This is where people like Turner exhibited, Gainsborough exhibited. This is art as painting is art. And then there was another kind of school of painting in South Kensington, where the British educationists wanted to revive all the arts which were dying out because of industrial revolution. So these were aimed, there was a whole training system aimed at the British working class, which they hoped they would be able to bring back into creating arts. And what they did, naturally, is whatever was okay for the British working class illiterate was okay for Indians. So that was, they started with that, they brought that philosophy to the teaching of arts in the Indian schools, particularly in Bengal. So what they did is they decided that Indian artisans and Indian craftsmen had to be taught how to paint. But what they did is they built all these schools in the cities. You know, all the workers, as I told you, most Indian workers, craftsmen, everyone lived in the villages. But the British built their colleges in cities. Then they had fees for these colleges, which these people were supposed to pay a fee. Then they had to buy equipment to learn their own trade. You know, if you're a painter, then you have to go and learn. And as a result, what happened is that those people for whom these art schools were meant got totally isolated. The craftsmen, the carpenters, the painters, those who lived in villages, isolated from this center. And what happened to these colleges? The people who rushed into them were the bourgeoisie, the people who had come in place, you know, the middle class that had come up in Bombay or Calcutta. And these people went in, and you get people, painters, new kind of painters like Abanindranath Tagore, not Rabindranath Tagore really, but Gaganendranath Tagore, and so on. So you see, a wholly new category arises in, this is what I mean by how the language changes one's perception of one society. Now, a whole new category which existed in Britain but didn't exist in India arises, which is the difference between the artist and the artisan. You see, these upper class people, Tagores and so on, why do they paint? They paint because they're inspired. They have vision, they have talent, they have gift, and they want to express themselves. Therefore, they are artists. But what happens to them? They're artisans. You know, they do what they've learned traditionally, and they are to be. And this was a category which was already being debated in Britain, and it's brought bodily into our language. And as a result, again, a whole class of painters emerged in India who looked upon these artisans with contempt and wanted to create an Indian tradition of their own by looking somewhere else. Now, this whole movement was led by the principal of the Calcutta School, Havel, and then Sister Nivedita and Anand Kumar Swami and others. And they literally created a tradition for Indian painting, which I think was nebulous until then. They looked at Ajanta, they looked at Mughal paintings, they looked at Japanese paintings, and you created this Shantiniketan school of painting. You see the whole paint, the work. What it represents is the spirituality. They all believed that Indians were spiritual, and the Western art was material. That was the Western society was material. So what painting they try to create is a painting that's representative in some sense of Indian spirituality. As a result, you get paintings, a whole school of paintings, where all the characters seem to be floating in air. They're shadowless, and they look, to me at least, completely sexless. You know, they're there, some kind of transparent figures floating around. And they didn't look at all the roots that were around them until Jamini Rai looked at, the pot paintings and others and created his own brand. But what happens as a result of this interference by the British in trying to teach us what painting is that nearly for 80 to 90 years, Indian painting gets completely lost. It's chaotic, and our history is chaotic. I mean, Saryu Doshi is here, she's an expert on it. I hesitate to hold forth on this, but this is the impression that I get, at least as an outsider. A third art form, which I would like to take an example of the same thing. You see, I didn't finish my second moral I was drawing from the second point. The point is, as a result, when we think of painting now, we think of Jamini Roy, we think of Gaganendranath Tagore, we think of Amrita Shergill, upper caste, middle class, upper middle class people, but those people who had kept Indian crafts going, the putt painters and so on, took a long time to be recognized as painters. You know, now there is a whole movement, and we get people like B.N. Goswami who are pointing out to us what was done by these people in this tradition. But in between, they were completely, seem to have disappeared from the scene. The third example, it's a much better well-known example, is that of dancers. As you know, now where shall I begin? That's a very complicated system. Dancing was kept alive in the Middle Ages by the Devdasis. Vijayanagar was a great center for dancing, and when Vijayanagar fell in 1565, many of the dancers fled to Tanjavur, where there was a Bhosle family, which, unlike its cousins here, it seems to me, was extremely oriented to arts and encouraged arts, and you know, everything that you think of South Indian as Carnatic music, Bharatanatyam, everything developed under the Bhosles in Tanjavur. And it continued. There were something like, I think, 25,000 Devdasis in Tanjavur in 1852-53. When the British did a Khalsa, they took away the king, they said he had no son, the throne was emptied, and suddenly these 25,000 women were without any support. And they had sustained the dance form. Now they had no support, and over the next 25-30 years, their economic situation continually deteriorated. In fact, by the turn of the century, they had reduced themselves to a state of prostitution. And in around 1910, a woman belonging to the same community brought a movement which was called anti-Nach movement. She wanted Muthu Lakshmi Reddy, she wanted dancing to be banned. She was so disgusted with the state of the dancers, of the women dancers in the South India, that she said, it's not enough to dance women, we have to ban the dance itself, Nach. The Nach itself has to be danced, and there was a big movement, the anti-Nach movement, to stop not only these women from performing, but from the dance itself from being spread. So in from 1900 to 1920, you get this big movement which looks as though Indian dance might disappear, and in some places it did disappear. Mysore, for instance. There is no school of Mysore Bharatanatyam left because the Mysore Diwan banned dancing in Mysore. And we only look to Chennai now because that whole tradition has been lost. Now, it was in this point that the Madras Music Academy in 1932 took a very important decision. Now, the Madras Music Academy had been formed in 1927 when there was an Indian National Congress meeting, and they had formed it to encourage Indian music. But a genius called E. Krishna Iyer said, it's not enough to save music, it's not enough to look at music, we must save dancing. Dance may be banned any moment, and it's in such a bad state that we must somehow dance it. And he persuaded the Madras Music Academy, which was essentially Brahminical because of its music content and so on. He persuaded the Madras Music Academy to invite two sisters, Kalyani sisters, to come and dance on stage, which they did in 1933. That's the first Indian dance on stage, to be performed on stage. But he did something more, which was quite extraordinary, which changed the history of Indian dance, which is that he persuaded Madras Music Academy, of course many people take credit for this, to change the name of the dance. The dance was known as Sadar, you know, like the Marathi Sadar Karne, you know, it comes from the Persian word Sadar, and these Devdasis called it Sadar, or they called it Dasiyatam, and so on. What E. Krishna Iyer, a real genius, did was to get the Madras Music Academy to change the name to Bharatanatyam. Now, people in India believe that Bharatanatyam the name is thousands of years old. And they think that the word Bharatanatyam refers to Bharata's Natya Shastra and so on. This is not true. The whole point is the name Bharatanatyam originates from the fact that the Devdasis had some gurus from the Brahmin community, some gurus from the Natwangam community, and the Brahmin gurus were called Bharatans, and the those from the community itself were called Natuans. Now, by calling it Bharatanatyam, what E. Krishna Iyer said is that this is a Brahmin dance. And the trick worked. It was picked up, the dance was picked up, then Rukmini Arundel started Kalakshetra, and the entire middle class in South then went in to teaching the children Bharatanatyam. But the interesting thing is, when Rukmini Devi Arundel while Rukmini Devi Arundel taught children Bharatanatyam and made it popular and gave it a new form and so on, she kept all artists from Devdasi community out of it. They were not admitted to her school, the children were not admitted, and all her musicians were great Brahmin singers. So again, a Brahminization of form, you can see taking place, and pushing out that entire community in the South. In fact, in 1937, when the Congress was elected in the regional elections, the first thing the Congress did was to ban Devdasism. They says Devdasis were forbidden. They didn't ban prostitution. Prostitution could continue, but somehow the Devdasi profession bothered them very much, And so you see again this difference between profession and a caste vocation. If dancing was a caste vocation, of course, the government didn't want to touch it because, of course, it's their pride, it's their right, it's their tradition to dance. But if it was a profession, then it could be banned, and that's the basis on which the government banned it. So after 30s, Bharatanatyam became, and dancing became, entirely a Brahminical exercise in South India, while those traditional Devdasis were left out. If you go to India, Madras today, and you say, who was the first Brahmin, who was the first woman to sing in public, they will say, D.K. Pattammal. Now, D.K. Pattammal sang in 1933. She was certainly the first Brahmin woman, a very bold woman and a great singer and so on, but she was not the first woman, because Devdasi women had been singing for hundreds of years in the South. But somehow, public memory tends to wipe out that particular part of it. Now, I won't go on, but when you talk of modern Indian culture, and one talks of it as 2,000 years old or 5,000 years old, one does not notice that the last 100 years have been really traumatic, and they have been traumatic for the various forces that have been working around it. But the one pattern that you see everywhere in all the arts is that those who kept these forms going were pushed out. They were either called folk, or they were either called degraded or something. And the upper caste, the urban upper caste, took over these forms and brought them to the cities and turned into their patrons. Now, when you look back on the development of Indian arts in the last century or more, how would one try to evaluate them? How would one try to evaluate them? I personally would like to break them into three different categories. The first is those arts which actually benefited during the British rule, which not benefited, but which came out of the British rule stronger. Now, the art form that came out strongest was music. The British never understood Indian music, although they tried to, try to do it. Sir Henry James had written on the musical mode of the Hindus in 1793. But they couldn't fathom it because they had one big problem. When the Indologists came here, they knew other ancient cultures. They knew Egypt, they knew Rome, they knew Greece, they knew India. But the point is, the music of Rome was lost, the music of Greece was lost, the music of Egypt was lost. They had all, those musical patterns had disappeared. But the Indian musical pattern hadn't disappeared. It was an ancient civilization, and the only one, probably China was the other one, which had a living tradition going back. And the British musicologists had great difficulty. And all the time, if you read the musical literature on musicology of the kind, they keep saying, something must have gone wrong. How can it remain like that? And how can Indian music remain untouched? It was corrupted somewhere, someone corrupted it, and then they go into the origins of Vedic music and how Vedic music must have been pure Hindu music, and during the medieval times, it was corrupted. Who corrupted it? The Muslims, since they were the singers then. They had kept the arts alive. So, a whole mythology is created of what the Muslim musicians did to it, how in 19th century, for instance, the music was in a very bad state, which it wasn't actually. Indian music in 19th century was flourishing. People usually say that when the Mughal Empire collapsed, things fell apart and, the Indian culture suffered badly, which is not entirely true. This is a very imperial idea put forward by the British that when an empire collapses, everything falls apart. The Mughal Empire collapsed, but the painters went to smaller towns, the dancers went to smaller towns, and there was a great efflorescence of the arts because of the collapse of the Mughal Empire. But anyway, that's not the point. The point is, music came out of the British system stronger because they had the sense not to interfere with it. They didn't understand it, in fact. And it was also a period in British music which was very fallow. There was no great British music maker during those 200 or 300 years when they were ruling us. Then there is a second category where there are Indian art forms which suffered, I think, because of interest taken by the British teachers. And the best example I have already given is painting. But then there is also architecture, for instance. Although the Mughals were such great builders, the British took upon themselves to teach us how to teach. And all the building that was done during the 19th and the 20th centuries was done by British architects, British engineers, until when, in the turn of the century, the whole Indian tradition of architecture is now in a need to be discovered, rediscovered, rebuilt. When New Delhi was being built, for instance, and they decided to build it, they didn't want any Indian workers. So Lutyens, who was given the charge, worked entirely with British architects. And then you have the New Delhi today, which is marvelous example of what Western idea of imperial architecture was. But the sad part of that was that when we became independent and Chandigarh had to be built, Nehru, who wanted to be international, also brought in a foreigner, a Frenchman. And what happened, you only have to go to Chandigarh to see what happens. I mean, it is a disaster as a city. So our architecture did go through a very bad patch, and it's only now in recent years, people like Doshi, for instance, and Charles Correa, who have tried to give it a semblance, and now a whole new generation is coming up. Now, this is the second category of arts. The third category of arts, from which we learnt a lot and which benefited us, was really in the form of technology. Now, there's no reason to go into photography, for instance, which came early. In Europe, photography replaced painting. It affected painting because of their concern with their obsession with reproduction. That didn't happen here. Here, our greatest photographers were, working together at the same time as our painting was also flourishing. Photography was there. But the greatest technical advance that came and that changed our society was recording of music. 1903, Gohar Jan did her first phonograph record, and suddenly it became possible for the middle class to possess music. Until then, to hear any music, you have to go to a Raja, Maharaja, sit in their palaces and so on. But music became available and increasingly put to increasingly productive and use. The most productive use, of course, is in the area of film. As you know, film started, Phalake's films were started in the soon after the Second World War. They were all silent. And if you read the reviews of 1920s of all the films, there is always a fear that Hollywood will swallow us up. We can't stand up to the Italian films. We can't stand up to the British films. Indian films will be swallowed up by this until sound comes to Indian cinema. And then, with the first sound film, the fear ceases. Because, as often has been said, with the coming of the sound in the West, the films began to speak, but in the East, in India, they began to sing. And with the coming of music, Indian music was completely rejuvenated. And we have had now, 1931 to now, 70 years, 80 years, 90 years, 90 years in which no other film industry has threatened India. Indian film industry continues. Regardless, of course, it's true that we can't make films of the kind they make, but they also can't make films of the kind we make. So, hum aapke hain kaun? Imagine a Hollywood producer trying to make that film. I mean, he would be completely baffled. This is not because Hollywood has not been trying to swallow Indian audiences. Please remember that 4 times as many people see Indian films than they see Hollywood films. But they make more money because the ticket rates are higher and so on. And really, music has been the savior of our film industry. We tend to laugh and say, why do our heroes and heroines dance and so on? Well, that's what we want, and that's what has defined our idea of entertainment, and that's, music has been a great, the pillar on which our film industry as well as modern music is now based. That finally brings me to the final section, which is what do we do with the electronic media that has come up. The great change in India that came up was with the opening of the skies, when the skies opened out, everyone said, oh, Fox will come, Murdoch will come, we will be flooded with television serials which were made abroad by Americans, by Bold and the Beautiful, and that kind of thing. But it didn't happen. Because ultimately, people loved to cry and laugh in their own mother tongue. And that's what happened in India. Immediately, the moment the skies opened out, now there are something like 18 to 20 channels in Kannada alone. Forget other languages. In Marathi, Tamil. And because of the revival of these channels, our arts have been rejuvenated in a way that we don't understand. For instance, today, you may say that the television channels are threatening Marathi, that people are watching television channels and not reading books and so on. But more people are using Marathi, more actors are using Marathi, more people are singing in Marathi, more people are performing in Marathi, as in Kannada, because of these channels, because of this electronic media. And a whole new rejuvenation, renaissance has become possible because of the electronic media. The greatest change, I think, that the electronic media will bring into Indian culture is that the division I mentioned earlier between the city and the village. Our cities were very much a part of the village, but the division which was created by the British, because the British kept everything in the cities. You have to come to the city for a hospital. You have to come to the city for a college. You have to come to the city for any kind of attention. That is breaking down because of the electronic media. Knowledge can go freely now into the villages, and I'm sure can be put to greater use. Now, I won't go into that. It's a subject that's being debated all around and something that we see all around. Let me just say that electronic media, although many people are depressed about it, electronic media has made a new kind of civilization possible. When we look at people talking on mobiles and you say, oh, he's not talking to, he's the person in front, he's only talking to mobiles. I say, why not? He's talking to someone. And he's talking to more people than he would be talking if there were no mobile, he or she or whatever it is. There's much more communication, much more exchange of ideas today than there has ever been, even among the classes which are deprived economically and socially. It's, I think, a situation which is fraught. I mean, no situation is ever simple, but I think very optimistic. And I'm very happy to end on that note. Let me say how grateful I am to you all for listening to this, and to Sahitya, Rangabhoomi, Pratishthan, and Vinod Doshi everything for inviting me here. Thank you very much.